So thank you, Charlie and Dan, for inviting me to be here. I'm actually on sabbatical this semester from East Bay Community Law Center, which is Bolt Hall's community-based clinic here. And I was just asked, why are you up here at the law school if you're on sabbatical? And for me, actually taking a sabbatical is a sabbatical from running or for being in the leadership of a large organization. The EBCLC is not just the large clinic here at Berkeley, it's also the biggest legal service provider of free legal services for people who otherwise can't afford lawyers in the county. And so it's a wonderful place to be as a law student, I think, and a wonderful place to work, but also very exhausting. And so I'm taking a little bit of a break from that. And part of my break is to think about and write about and work on the pieces about that work, that daily work of working with the 40 people who work in the organization, the supervising attorneys who supervise law students and provide legal services in the community, the clients who work with our community partners, our adversaries, the cities that we work within, is to step away from that and to think about things like mindfulness practice and how to incorporate it authentically and in a way that's in the service of the work and the mission and the service of the education mission. And think about working in a practice that's about addressing the causes and conditions of poverty. And so we're hosting, actually, with the Henderson Center, a symposium in October, which I hope many of you will come to, around how do we do this work as lawyers? What is the role of law and lawyers in that? So for me, a sabbatical is just stepping back and doing the work that I do, but not at the frenetic pace I have to do it in when I'm sitting in the seat of the director. So I'm really happy to be here and to think about these things. I'm going to put this on so I try to keep myself on time. Lawyers are terrible about time management in speaking. And I'm guilty, or I will be guilty of coming here to talk with you. And so I am going to speak and then leave time, I hope, for conversation and questions. And know that these are all just stories, and they're all just things, observations or thoughts I have on this, and they're all works in progress, and they're all things that I hope as a lifetime learner will evolve and change and aren't fixed, and that you probably have as much for me to learn from as you could possibly learn from me. So I'm going to tell a story, because I often do tell stories, and then give you a couple thoughts about mindfulness and the law and social justice work. So this is the story. When I was still seeing clients at the Law Center, which I actually haven't done for a few years, except for sporadically when I'm called upon to show up in court because no one else can go, and I still have an active bar card, which is really scary, but a good thing to do periodically. I had a client come in, and she was a woman my age, and she came in because she and her mother were being asked to leave their house. And this was a few years back, kind of right at the height of the foreclosure crisis and the beginning of what we're still, feeling the effects of this Great Recession. And she came in, and she and her mother were being asked to leave their house because their house had been sold in foreclosure, and a new landlord had bought it and said, "You have to leave. We're the new owners, and you have to leave." And she explained that she and her mother had been living there for 14 years. This was in Oakland, and she's African American, and that she and her mother had been living in this house for 14 years, and her mom was now had gone out on workers' comp from an injury, and then had been on state disability for a few years, and was applying for federal disability. And she had also just been laid off, and really just a layoff. One of these, she worked for a company that laid off half of the employees just during the kind of height of the recession, and she was actively looking for work. And so it was like kind of the worst time to be told they were leaving a house they were in for 14 years, because you can imagine they were paying a good rental price because they'd been in this house for years, and there are rental protections in Oakland and Berkeley. And so we kind of explained to her, as we do in our tenants' rights workshops, and that she doesn't have to, that a new owner can't just evict someone because they're the new owner, that tenants have rights and that's not a grounds for eviction. And so we did what we do, right, which we empowered her to go back with her mom and say this to the landlord and sent her on her way. And she did. She said, you can't actually just evict us. There's a process. And the landlord, she came back then week after week, because we have clinics week after week. And the landlord then said, kind of kept saying, you need to leave, but also started doing work on the property, which is okay, except for some of the work was like taking out the sink, shower, and toilet in the house and not replacing it for weeks. So things that actually aren't okay. So again, she came back and it was like, this isn't right. You can do something about this. We will empower you to do this. And she went back and asserted her rights about that too. There's more to this story, and you're listening as future lawyers, and so hopefully you have already lots of questions about the laws and technicalities of it, which I won't get into here. But eventually what happened is we got a call from this woman and her mom saying that there was a police officer at their door coming to arrest her, the daughter. I'm not and was not a housing lawyer. I didn't do tenants' rights. I'd gotten involved because I was staffing clinic. But with the housing lawyers, we literally suited up and drove out to this house because there was a cop there to arrest her, to say what was going on. And what had happened is the cop, who was a Oakland cop, and very tall and white man cop, had come to their house and knocked on the door of our client, who said that she was under arrest for violating a restraining order that the landlord, who was a white woman, had issued a stay-away order from her own home, because she had felt threatened and there had been threats. And our client said to us she'd never seen this restraining order, she'd never heard about this restraining order, so she actually had no idea why she was in violation of it. And also there hadn't really been an incident other than the landlord had come to her house and she had said, you can't come into our home right now, you need to give us notice before coming into the house. And 3 attorneys, myself, Mark and Laura from our housing practice, were there to try to convince this police officer not to arrest our client. And literally, it just seemed like we're lawyers and we know the law, and the client, and we seen the copy of the restraining order, and there wasn't a clear proof of service. I mean, there was just things to argue right then about that this wasn't right, that they should not arrest her. And we took on different roles, all try to talk to the cop and get him to see this and understand that this is an injustice. And Mark, you yell at the cop and tell him we're going to take him down or call his supervisor. I mean, we got on the phone to the mayor's office. I mean, literally, I think we did everything as advocates at that moment that we could do. It just was one of those things that to me seemed clear that this was wrong. How could they arrest this person for being in her own home? And I had come to law school, to stand up for people who couldn't stand or didn't have the skills right there in their hand or just needed someone to stand up with them. This was exactly what I wanted to do in terms of the work. And I lived and breathed the stories of when it was successful, like when people stood up and did the right thing. And so that's what we were doing. Laura and Mark and I and the clients were there to stand up to this. And we called the chief of police. This went on for hours, right? And at the end of it, the officer put my client in handcuffs and put her in the back of a cop car someplace she had never been in her life. In the years of going to school as in Oakland and getting herself to college and getting a good job and taking care of her mother, he put her in handcuffs and put her in the back of a cop car and drove away. And I was just done. I was just done. I was done. I was like, I'm done with law. I'm done. I can't teach this to another law student. I can't make them think it's important to do this work. I can't do this anymore. I'm just done. it was that devastating just to bear witness to that, to be that close to what just was wrong, was just wrong. I was just done. So sitting in stillness and silence and trying to pay attention to your thoughts with compassion, which is kind of the statement you hear about like mindfulness practice. I kind of love simple statements that you can then unpack a lot of, right? There's a lot to that idea of just sitting in stillness and silence and trying to pay attention to your thoughts and your feelings and your physical sensations with compassion. And for me, kind of unpacking what that does, what is helpful about that practice. One of the key pieces of it is that piece of sitting and looking at our own thoughts and feelings and physical sensations with compassion. But that is a very hard practice. And I think in the earlier exercise and the guided meditation with loving kindness, people's responses to that, to paying attention to our own thoughts and feelings, sometimes it's hard because we're not empathetic to ourselves, or sometimes it's just hard because there's a lot of them going on all the time. And it's multitasking, just paying attention to the thoughts and feelings and physical sensations going on in yourself, let alone outside of yourself. But that practice of doing it over and over again and actually coming back to paying attention to it is transformational. Because, frankly, for me, if I can sit and pay attention to my own thoughts and feelings and physical sensations with some level of compassion, then I can do that in outside of myself anytime. Because Anne Lamott is a great Bay Area writer, says, "My mind is a dangerous neighborhood. I rarely venture there alone." My own thoughts and physical sensations and feelings are terrifying at times. Or they're petty and ridiculous or absurd. Or they're righteous and full of fire, but not particularly useful or informed. They are embarrassing at times. So if I can actually sit and pay attention to them with some level of compassion, it is incredible the level of compassion I can feel for other people. So I told you that story, and for me, it was easy to have empathy and compassion with the client. She was like me in lots of ways. She felt familiar. And then also she was like some idea of, I think, clients of EBCLC, right? She was an easy client, which mostly we don't have, right? A client who came and she had wherewithal to assert her own rights and was down to be a partner in the law. A lot of times we don't have clients who have those resources or reserves. Our clients come to us pissed off at how they've been treated by every bureaucracy. Or they come with no bandwidth to even engage with us in even a civil way sometimes, let alone engage with people who they've felt they have been attacked by, whether it's a school or a prison or the police or anyone else, right? This was a client that was easy to feel empathy with. And it was so clear that something wrong was happening. That was really clear. But what was the harder part, and what I have been exploring partly through this practice, is actually having empathy with the other cast of characters in there, right? And having some kind of compassion there, so that I can take a clear stand about what I think is right and be an advocate in it, and not do it from a place where I do the same thing that happened to my client. My client was demonized, and that's why a white cop could come and see a black woman and think it was okay to just arrest her, given the facts that they had, which was very little. And I don't say that to say that that's a stereotype or an assumption or just to feed a stereotype and assumption of white cops. I don't look at that way. I don't look at all white men that way or white cops that way either. I don't assume that they are all racist. I actually assume they have best intentions. And I also assume that they work in a place and live in a world where they could make that assumption about someone. that they would have implicit bias so deeply ingrained and reinforced and frankly supported by the system that they work, that would be okay to them, that they would take the benefit of the doubt for this person making this claim, that they were threatened because of who she was and what she looked like, and that they would assume it was true based on who my client was and who she looked like. And so I could see what was wrong in his approach and be totally clear on that, and still actually have some understanding or even some story about that officer. I've met him since. We had to depose him. I'll tell you that story. But I've met him since. I don't think he's an ill-intended human being. How do I have empathy even with those landlords who bought up 5 properties on that block and did the same thing over and over again? Who lied in documents that later surfaced? I mean, literally perjured themselves and forged documents, right? How do I have some empathy for those clients? I mean, for those landlords in this case? And I actually can, even there, have a story that is a story of compassion about why and how they did the things that they did, and still be clear of what my role is as an advocate. And those things are hard. That's cognitive dissonance, holding those two things together, right? Being clear about one thing and what position I can take, but also coming at it from a place of compassion for everyone involved. But there is something very beneficial to it for me in the work that I don't have to demonize people the same way my clients have been demonized in order to even fight against them, right? In order to even challenge what they do. I don't have to. I don't actually have to come from that place. I also think it's really beneficial in the work, right? That coming from that place leaves you open to the many, many, many stories and can make you a better advocate by understanding where people will come from, including trying to come up with resolutions to conflict that aren't the automatic, kind of lawyer's response to conflict, like, always going first to the biggest tool, the litigation tool or whatever, or the threat of litigation tool, but thinking, how do I use other pieces? How do I see if at some point these people's interests were aligned and then diverged? How do I get back to somewhere closer to the point of alignment? Is that possible? So sitting in stillness and silence and paying attention to my thoughts and feelings and discomfort and physical discomfort in meditation, which I find like horror, and it's not just because I'm old, I've always found it very uncomfortable to meditate at times. Paying attention to that with some compassion has made it much easier, or made it possible to have that and to hold that compassion outside and outside of myself, even in the most conflict driven and conflict-ridden places. Another piece of it is I just touched on, is the sitting with suffering. That the physical pain is the easiest thing. I sat in a chair today, but when I sit on a cushion for long periods of time, it is physically can be very uncomfortable. I just have this one problem with my knee that was from when I was a kid, and I always so I could literally just spend an entire meditation for 30 minutes just thinking about my knee. I mean, which is not, so the wonderful practice of noticing that pain and then coming back to the breath or coming back to being present is a great exercise. Now I try to stretch it out first, but from there, thinking about that, sitting with yourself is sitting with your own suffering. There's some point where that is what is happening, because that's part of the human condition, is suffering. So sitting with our own stuff and paying attention to it, and again looking at it with compassion, is a way to sit with people and other people in suffering. And in social justice work or public interest work, or the different ways it's thought of, you are running towards and sitting with always with suffering, because what you're sitting with is injustice. You're sitting with abuse of power. You're sitting with explicit and implicit discrimination. You're sitting with the many ways our society creates great imbalance, and you're trying to step in and counter it or challenge it or lessen the impacts of it always. And so the capacity to sit with that, not from a place of pity, not from a place of in some ways, which is a natural reaction, almost feeling more okay with your life because of sitting so close to greater suffering, but sitting with it in true kind of acceptance, ability to hold, and even solidarity is what makes it possible to do that work long term. In all the ways I hope all of you in some way will do it, which is to say that all of you will care about the law as a tool for justice in some way, that it is more noble than just the business of law, that the underlying ideals and ideas of law are bigger than that, and that our responsibility, therefore, is bigger than that. And to do that in a sustainable way, in a way that that is bearable, because it's heartbreaking and soul-crushing at times, requires some ability to have space. And to me, the sitting practice is that creates that space, a buffer of noticing and accepting and being there to bear witness. And so even in this story I told you, to not be destroyed by watching my client with the officer's hand on her head and ducking her into this cop car and driving away, and not just say, I can't do this. This is just, I can't bear this. You know, or walking down the street and turning away from homelessness, or turning away from a wrong you see happening in front of you because you just can't bear it. I can't bear it all the time, but our chronic, urge is to not bear it ever. And so the way for me to be able to bear it ever and to keep doing the work has been to have that space to be able to sit in suffering and hold it, but not hold it so tight that it either destroys me or makes me unable to see or need to turn away from it. So in that story I told you, I didn't just quit that day. I'm still at the law center. And we also didn't just quit working with that client. I mean, after getting her out on bail or helping her get out on bail, that was a long, long case that we worked on. There still was fighting the eviction. There was also going into court for the temporary restraining order that had, it turned out, been it had been forged. I mean, literally, the signature on the proof of service had been forged. And we actually found the person whose signature it was walked into our office one day. We all knew this person's name because we were like, who is this person? And wrote a declaration that they had never signed that proof of service. It was fighting the eviction, but at that point also helping that family move, because they weren't going to stay in that house under that landlord in those conditions, but to get them a way to move out with dignity and be able to move into a place where they could afford. So with a settlement, move-out settlement. And in that case, it was staying with that case long enough to sue, to use that litigation tool. The landlords, after trying many other ways to resolve the issue, and sue them for what they had done. And to get $400,000 judgment for our clients that made it so that they could buy a house and not have to deal with that again. And that took years. It's not like on TV. And it was awful for them at times to go through that process of reliving, this and actually getting our client's record expunged so that arrest wouldn't show up, right? That was a huge deal, that arrest would not show up on her record forever. And the process itself meant that we had to go through civil litigation before we could get her record expunged, get that record sealed. So those things are like the heartache of sticking with that work. but also to me, the blessing of being at an organization that says we're just going to stick through this case. That this isn't, we have to stick through this case. We have to do this work. And we have to do it in a way that supports a family who, for many reasons also, this was the hardest thing. And like all people, they would want to turn away from it or walk away from it and forget it, even if they couldn't because it was on their records. But that we would stick with them. And they had to stick with us then too. That was us all working on that. And so the final kind of piece of sitting in stillness and silence and paying attention to our thoughts and feelings and with some compassion, I guess thing that I learned through that practice, and practice. I love that it's called practice. My silly Buddhist friends, we have a club called Competitive Buddhism. Anyway, she was going to make a shirt that said, "Practice makes practice." Always just practice. So when I say these things, they are things I'm practicing all the time. And sometimes practicing is leads to total failure. And sometimes it leads to, okay, that was helpful. But kind of a more global idea, which I'm so glad this all started with loving kindness practice, where I sit, which is East Bay Meditation Center, we call metta practice, which is just Sanskrit for loving kindness. But is that, and this feels antithetical in some ways to me in my training as a lawyer, is that caring about justice, sitting and bearing witness to injustice, actually trying to do something, whatever it is, in whatever capacity we have, that doing that from a place of love, as opposed to or through a place of fear and anger, including righteous anger, that for me is a journey and a practice still. That for many people, and definitely like in the story I told you, in that moment, I wanted to throw rocks and light things on fire and quit my job and scream and yell and cry. And many times in the work of doing social justice or public interest or organizing or political action work, it's come from a place of incredible anger and sadness and hurt. And I came back from a news strike to Ferguson and Gaza and the drought in California and the onslaught of news that was coming. I actually just was like, this is it, the zombie apocalypse is here now, and call it what you want, but that's obviously what we are there. I just was completely overwhelmed. And it does I can joke, but it makes me angry and terrified. And I have not so small children, and I just, I'm like, how can we live in this world that this is true? And actually, so I immediately went to East Bay I was like, I have to go to East Bay Meditation Center, to the People of Color Sit, actually, because I knew what I would hear there was talking honestly about the anger and the fear that brings up. And by the way, the total resistance of anger and fear, which is, I think, another thing that happens, is we just don't even want to go there, and so we just don't pay attention to things because it will only cause anger and fear. So either the numbness or the actual anger and fear, I knew what would happen is that there would be a conversation about how to talk through and work through that, and also come from a place of compassion and righteous, fiery, activist compassion about these huge issues going on right around us, right here in our own communities and throughout the country and the world. And there was a great speaker who quoted Thich Nhat Hanh, who I think of as a great activist Buddhist, and who started the talk about war and and the great violence of war. And it felt like, oh my God, this is a Buddhist talk? What are we? And got to a place of how do we do this from a place of love. I love Cornel West's quote. I love lots of Cornel West quotes, but that justice is what love looks like in public. And to me, when I say love, at risk of sounding totally cheesy, even in a group like this, to me, it's the least cheesy thing ever. The idea of justice being what love looks like in public. And that, and for me, practice, and it's just practice and practice and practice, is a way to come from that place as much as I can in my work, in my life, with my family, and as a touchstone to get back to in the many times I don't come from that place. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to comments or questions or thoughts. And thank you for letting me tell some stories and share some thoughts. Questions, thoughts, ideas, noises? Yes. That's a great question. And so first of all, my journey, my passage to mindfulness practice at all is, just to be transparent, was from a Buddhist practice, and actually it was, and I don't consider myself a Buddhist, but that is where it's come from. And so in the practice the practices I've been exposed to, they talk about the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha, right? The practice is the teacher and the lessons of the teacher and the community. And for me, those things are what always bring me back, is that I work in a community of lawyers and legal advocates and organizers and teachers who are my legal Sangha. They are my community. And so literally I was in this experience with these clients and with these two other lawyers from my office who were there and saw it and bore witness and were in it. And so it never was something where I had to hold it alone. And then we could come back to an office where, again, our lawyers and the students who work with us are part of this community, and then a broader community. That work with those clients, it took the housing unit, it took the clean slate practice, it took our neighborhood justice clinic. There was like 4 units working on that, and then we worked with other partners because that's what it took to actually unpack all the different things that had happened. And so I do think finding your community, your Sangha, whether in law school or outside of the practice, is what will bring you back. And then again, for me, someone mentioned resisting being raised in a Buddhist family. My mother is like a 30-year lay ordained Zen practitioner. So I was like, I am as likely to become a Buddhist practitioner. Well, never mind. Anyway, I was totally resistant to practice. And so for me, coming to mindfulness practice was through tons of resistance, cynicism, disdain probably. And then to come to it meant coming to it as myself and as an adult and in my own way. And so it's been, it's a good journey to have gone on. But then I do get to look to teachings, again, whether it's secular teachings on mindfulness practice or whether it's from many different religions. I think coming to teaching, finding teachers and finding community is the way you get through and ground yourself always. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for sharing, first off.
Thanks. It's hard.
But I was thinking about sort of this tension that seems to exist, acceptance of suffering and acceptance
Yeah.
desire to reform it and reject that, and that there's this by love or whatever it is that enables you to exist. Sort of sitting with the suffering, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean, and that hits on something I think that, or at least how I hear it, that it's essential around kind of issues around for social justice advocates and mindfulness or Buddhist practitioners, right? It's like acceptance implies like, and I resist this language sometimes, acceptance implies like, it's okay. It sounds a lot like status quo, which if you're a social justice advocate, the idea of status quo being okay is like, we're working for change. That doesn't work. So one thing is for me is that's why I try to talk about the cognitive dissonance thing, that things can simultaneously exist that seem in tension or in conflict, and how to hold that and be able to take not have that create total inaction and inertia because it feels too intentional, or that you have to reject something and accept the other. So I think that that's important to think about. I don't think understanding and seeing what is, and even some level of I have to come up with a different word other than acceptance. It's like the idea of non-judgment. That term is ridiculous to me. First of all, you're being trained to judge. That's law. Your job is to judge. And also, as it turns out, humans just judge. That's how we survive in the world. That's how we actually survive forever, is judgments. It's the value judgments we attach. This is good. I judge this to be good. I judge this to be bad. Paying attention to that is really helpful. But trying to say you're going to have non-judgment, that's nice, but I don't know that I'm even aspiring to that. I want to notice my judgments and pay attention. I want to accept only in that I see that this is the reality and this is true, and try to understand why it's reality. I do not then see that as a way to say I accept this and don't want to change it. Because I'm on sabbatical, I'm on PTA, which I never thought I would join the PTA at my kid's school, and I'm like, almost embarrassed about it, but so I have to talk about it a lot because I have to run at that discomfort. But I said at an event, I'm on PTA because I love this school, and I love it enough to challenge what I don't love about it. I love it enough to say what isn't okay about this school, and that's love. So I absolutely see, in the story I told, I really can feel compassion for everyone involved, and I actually can feel very clear then, because I feel compassion and don't demonize anyone there, why I need to advocate here and bring the skills and talents I have as a lawyer to this place of that. And I feel better about even being very strong in advocacy when I know I'm coming from that place than I did when I needed to demonize the other side in order to feel righteous.
Thanks, Tirien.
Thank you.